This is episode 245 of the Beyond the Food Show, and today we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma with an expert, Dr. Carolyn Ross. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Going to Beyond the Food Show. I'm Stephanie Dozier, clinical nutritionist and emotional eating expert, creator of the Going to Beyond the Food method, and founder of the Going to Beyond the Food Academy. Corporate executive turned health expert with my own journey with weight, body image, and food. It's now my mission to help smart, successful women like you live confidently right now and unconditionally. Ready, sister? Let's do this. Welcome back, my sister. Your host here, Stephanie Dozier, and today is a follow-up to episode 244, which was titled So You Stop Dieting, and also to episode 243 with Sarah, where we share her story of overcoming 30 years of chronic dieting. And I'm going to speak today in the context of trauma and dieting being a trauma and being passed on from generation to generation and generation. And having worked with now thousands of women and helping them shift their beliefs about their body, stopping dieting, learning intuitive eating, and surveying the people that I work with, I can tell you that nearly 70% of the women have been taught to diet by their parents or have been told by a medical doctor way back when that they needed to lose weight, and that kickstarted their dieting career. Dieting is, in most cases, passed on from generation to generation. And although science doesn't agree yet with me, I want you to think of chronic dieting as a trauma. Granted, it may not be on the same scales of trauma as perhaps physical abuse, sexual abuse, or even the trauma of our Black community, which is around slavery, and that being passed on from generation to generation. Dieting may not be to that same scale, but it's still a trauma, because when you look at the definition of trauma, it is a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing and disturbing. And we know that that's what dieting does to us. And it does have side effects, just like any other trauma that we think of, our distorted relationship to food, to our distorted relationship to our body image, the mental distress, the low self-confidence and low self-esteem and perfectionism. Now, the reason why I say that science doesn't agree to that yet is because dieting is still perceived as being, quote, okay. Now, I want you to sit with that and think about what will happen in 100 years from now, when we have a full understanding, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, and even spiritually, of the side effect of chronic dieting. We will have a different perspective. We're just not there yet. Now, today, we do understand the side effect of trauma for many other aspects of our society that we think about what's going on currently in our society with racism, right? That the trauma, for an example, as I referred earlier, of the Black community, of slavery, that trauma being passed on from generation to generation. And that became really evident for me over the last few weeks as I'm doing my own anti-racist work. As I share that, and I'm going to put the link to a blog post I've written about the commitment of myself and my company to being anti-racist. I was watching through this work a documentary on Netflix called 13th. And if you haven't watched it yet, I would highly recommend that you do. And as I was watching this documentary explaining the intergenerational trauma of the Black community way back to the years of slavery and how it's affecting them today and how it's impacting how society perceives Black people, I right away sent an email to a friend and a colleague, Dr. Carolyn Ross, to come and share her expertise in explaining this concept of intergenerational trauma to you, to me. I'm not the expert here. That's not my field. So I have absolutely no shame in calling in other people that know better than I do. And what's really interesting about Dr. Carolyn Ross, she's been on the show many times. She's been part of all the summits that I've done in the past. She's even worked with me on her own business. She is also a Black woman who lived in Southern USA in the time of segregation. And that's where her personal interests came through on intergenerational trauma, and that she later on started to observe in her own practice. Dr. Carolyn Ross is an expert in eating disorder and a pioneer in the use of integrative medicine. And she's the former head of the eating disorder program at Sierra Tucson, which is one of the #1 treatment center for eating disorder in the world. And she now runs a program called Anchor, which helps women, chronic dieter, who perhaps have been diagnosed with an eating disorder to recover and come back to a normal eating pattern and a good relationship with their body. So she has that personal experience with intergenerational trauma in the context of racism, but also in the world of chronic dieting. So this interview is perfect for us in this community. So we are going to explore all the angle of intergenerational trauma, but also how to interrupt the patterns and this passing on from generation to generation of this trauma. After the interview, I will be sharing my personal action plan and also some resources for you. So stay tuned till the end. Ready? Let's do this interview. Welcome to the podcast, Carolyn.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's like coming home. It's good to be back on your podcast.
How many times has it been?
Oh, I don't know. Well, you've been on mine. I've been on yours. I don't know. It's been a lot.
3 or 4 times for sure. I think between that and the summit, you've been here a lot. So for people who don't know, and I'll link to the other episode in the show note, Dr. Carolyn Ross, maybe the name you know her under. She's been on our podcast many times. But the reason why I asked her to be here today is to teach around a very particular topic that she's just completed a TEDx talk around. And it's about intergenerational trauma. We're going to talk about this, and she's going to teach us what it is, but we're going to speak to it to 2 different angles, both race and size. But let's get started with what the heck is intergenerational trauma?
Well, intergenerational trauma is actually a term from psychology, which asserts, and we're now being able to prove, that trauma can be passed from one generation to children and grandchildren. So it refers to specific effects of trauma being passed down through the generations. So it doesn't mean that people were all traumatized at the same time. That would be that's the difference with historical trauma, like the Holocaust is a historical trauma. Slavery was a historical trauma. What Native Americans and other indigenous people experienced, those are all historical traumas. But the intergenerational trauma, like you can have a Holocaust survivor who has post-traumatic stress disorder and copes with that PTSD by not acknowledging their emotions, what we call psychic numbing. And their children then feel that as emotional abuse or neglect, and then they may parent their own kids in the same way. So that effect of the original trauma, which the second and third generation didn't experience, some of them didn't even hear about from their own parents, but the effects of trauma were passed on to 2 or 3 generations. Now they've been able to show, which I think is so fascinating. Let me geek out for here a moment.
Go for it. We like that.
That in animal studies, they've been able to show this effect being transferred into the 3rd generation. So they took mice and they shocked them whenever they presented a smell of cherries. So then the mice became afraid. Whenever they smelled the cherries, they would tense up and be afraid of being shocked. Okay, then they had babies. Those babies were not exposed to the shock at all. But if they were presented with the cherry smell, they would have the same reaction. And then they went to yet another generation, and the exact same thing happened. So that third generation had no shocking at all, but still was completely reactive to the smell of cherries. And that's, I think, is really helpful because it's starting to help us to explain, how does this happen? Like, you have a trauma. No, but the children haven't been in the Holocaust. How did that get passed down? And now we can see that it's due to epigenetics. So epigenetics is the expression of genes. So a gene, say, for addictions or obesity, can be turned on by these traumatic experiences, and then that change in the gene expression is what's passed on. So in Holocaust survivors, they found methylation of a gene associated with a stress response. The methylation change is what's being passed from generation to generation, which can make you more hyperactive to stress, which we see in people with PTSD. But now we're starting to see that it's in their children as well.
So the variation in gene, well, that can get passed on, but also, I don't know how it's called, but the behavior of the parent towards their children, which is affected by the trauma, will then create
changes in the children as well.
In the child.
Yeah, there's this, kind of a social model. So I think they call it social learning theory, that they had used to explain the effects in Holocaust survivors. That, say a parent has PTSD, then obviously they're going to parent in a different way than someone who doesn't have PTSD. But then how do you explain that going into the third generation? Well, okay, maybe there's some impact from the second to the third, whatever. But really, the biggest impact of all is this epigenetic change in gene expression that puts people at higher risk than for whatever the genes are: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, addictions, depression, anxiety. And that then explains some of what we're seeing with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And, seeing that having early life adversity puts you at higher risk for those same things. And if you've been traumatized, then that puts your children at higher risk too. It's not simple genetics, it's epigenetics. You know what I'm saying, Stephanie?
I do. The reason why, and I want to put this into context. So I knew that Caroline was interested in this topic for months, and I was looking for the perfect occasion or way of bringing her back to the podcast. And it happened in the month between the month of May and June with the social, call it crisis, that happened throughout the world around racism. And I was watching one night, part of my own education as a white person, I was watching the Netflix documentary called 13th.
Yes.
Which really called it out for me, how the Black community, part of the reason why the struggle is present is, yes, because of us and how white people act and behave and think, but also that intergenerational piece. Can you speak to that in the context? And for people who have not seen you, you're a Black person. So it's really something you're talking from a lived experience.
Well, and even if they see me, they may not know because I am a light-skinned Black person. But I think we want to make a distinction here because there is historical trauma. And I think historical trauma is intergenerational trauma, but it's trauma that's experienced by an entire group of people. And usually there have to be, a couple of components to that, like it affects the whole group and then it affects their offspring and so on. So that's how slavery was. And I think most people know what slavery is and maybe even know the history of slavery in the United States. But the most detrimental part of slavery, is, at least in the United States, was what's called chattel slavery. And that is based on the notion that Black people are inferior to white people and that they're in some way animalistic or not as smart, or, and the eugenics that we've seen in various countries around the world over the ages is part of that. But it's particularly insidious in the United States, because even once slavery was over, people in the South continued to view Blacks in the same way. And not only was it just an internal view, but they acted upon that in very damaging ways, such as the Jim Crow laws, the prohibition of mixed marriages, the separate education, the colored only drinking fountains. That's the world I was born into when I grew up as a little girl in Texas. My grandfather, who was a very well-known physician in a small town in Texas, was targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. He was to speak at a rally for the NAACP, which is a Black organization, and only because he was called out to deliver a baby did he miss being shot by the KKK. Instead, his good friend received that bullet and died in his stead. So this isn't theoretical. This is what actually happened. And as I told you, when I got the opportunity to do a TEDx talk on this subject, a lot, I think for most Black people in America, we'd rather not look at 12 Years a Slave, the movie, or the movie 13. It's so painful. It's like watching the documentary about the death of John F. Kennedy, who was a hero in the Black community and so on. But when I was, getting ready to do the TEDx talk, a lot of these memories came back, and the amount of kind of shame associated with them, the internalized feeling that, there's something wrong with us, that we were treated this way, I think is the hardest part of racism to deal with. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. And as you're speaking, it's even like I'm hearing your words and I'm feeling my own shame as a white person. Although it's not me who did it to you, I still feel the shame of my own ancestor, having segregated your family and your parents and you when you were a child. And I think, and I don't want this to be about me, I want this for people to understand that these emotions that we are feeling, both of us from a different perspective, are what is called trauma. That's what happened. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. And well, I think that's why what's happening in the United States and also around the country, because other countries, any colonizing country has perpetrated this same kind of violence against Native people, whether it be Native Americans or, Aborigines or whatever. But I think what's important about what's happening is that we are starting to talk about it. I never went around just saying to people, "Hey, I'm a Black woman." Hey, or in any way trying to show that off, or even though inside I felt, myself. I just kind of felt like, you know what? If they don't know I'm Black, too bad. They're going to have to talk to the hand. So, but I think what is hard for many, many people to understand, they may say, and even many Black people say, well, that was 200 years ago. Why are you still talking about that? But one of the writers that I particularly like, and she has a lot of YouTube videos too, Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, PTSS. And she lists what the legacy of slavery is in modern day African Americans. And she lists three things. One is something called vacant esteem. And that's a sense of inability to develop primary self-esteem. And instead there's hopelessness, depression, and a general outlook that's kind of self-destructive. And we see that in a lot of the looting that's going on and some of the things that have happened in the past. And then the second thing she says as part of PTSS is a marked propensity for anger and violence, extreme kind of paranoia, feeling you can't trust people. And sometimes this is internalized, so there's violence against yourself or people in your community, friends, relatives, etc. And then internalized racism, this, learned helplessness. Some people in our community identify more with the white community. And I mean, I've seen posts on YouTube, Black people, one Black woman who was saying she thought there was no reason that we should be vilifying George Floyd instead of, oh yeah.
Oh, is that Candace Owen?
Young or Owen?
Oh yeah, Candace Owen. Yeah.
That's her.
She got me riled up too.
I was like, what? I had to go and listen again. I'm like, am I really hearing this? Yeah. So, that's what's called internalized racism. And to make the segue to, what we always talk about, weight stigma and so on, it's very similar to what we see with weight stigma, where some people of size internalize the feelings of negativity about their own bodies from what they've been taught by society, right? I mean, you see that, and they hate their bodies, and they're very negative and often abusive toward their bodies because of that internalized bias that came from society. And we're seeing this same kind of parallel, like I think it was Martin Luther King who said, or maybe it was Nelson Mandela, I think, who said people aren't born racist. So the studies show that by the age of, like, if you'd look at a 5-year-old and show them different pictures of different colored people, they don't register any difference. But by age 7, they do. And they start to identify with their group and feel like the other group is bad or wrong or the other. And we've seen the exact same thing around fatness, right?
Yes.
Like even 3-year-olds will not play with toys portraying someone live in a larger body, right?
And I saw a movie, a old YouTube video, must have been dated of the 80s, just 2 days ago, about a study with young children and dolls. They had a black doll and a white doll, and they were asking that 5 or 6-year-old to say, which is the most beautiful doll, to white children and black children. And guess what? Both child, the black and the white, picked the white doll.
Yeah. Well, for many, many decades, there were no black dolls. There was no black Barbie when Barbie came out.
True.
There was no black Cabbage Patch initially. So that was the model that was taught to consolidate white people in as the superior race.
So I want to bring that in home to people to understand this impact of intergenerational trauma, for people to understand why we need to help as white people, for those listening that are white, the Black community, because of this notion of intergenerational trauma. Some individuals are starting to step back because of that piece. Would you agree to that statement?
Yeah, tell me what you mean by that.
So for an example, an individual all individuals in the Black community would have been affected by the intergenerational trauma of racism. And in some cases, because of low self-esteem, which is the number one point that you've noted, may not have the confidence to go for certain opportunity in their life.
Absolutely.
Right? They're starting to step back from the person who's white, who's done nothing more. They just have a higher self-esteem.
Yeah. And they have white skin.
On top.
Yeah, on top. Yeah. So I think that's really hard for people to understand. And I just recently saw a video of a professor, an African-American professor, who talked about this very thing. And she talked about it as, like, say you're in a room, and in your room, all you see are open signs. So every path is open to you. But on the other side of the wall, they're not seeing the open sign. They're seeing only the closed sign. So every path is closed to you. So over time, you stop trying even if you are highly educated, or you're a professional like myself, I can't tell you how many times, those subtle things happen where you don't get the promotion, you don't get the salary raise, you don't get the next opportunity, even though your opportunities are up here. And someone who's maybe a manual laborer or who is uneducated, their opportunities are even more limited. But I think that portrayal really brought home to me that if you're inside that room, that's what we call privilege.
Yes.
So you may be white, or you may be a woman, or you may, be prettier than other people, or more handsome or tall for men.
And
Or
thin privilege.
thin privilege. Yeah.
Yes.
Thin privilege. Yes. Bring it home, girl. That's what I like.
So let's segue that into sizeism, right? Let's
Yeah.
talk about thin privilege and this, I don't think there's any study on this. This is me speaking from clinical observation. I believe that we have intergenerational trauma between women to daughter when it comes to diet culture. What's
Oh
your
my
opinion as a
gosh.
professional?
Totally agree with that. How many times have you or I taken a history on someone and found out the mom was a frequent dieter? She started her daughter on a diet at age 5, and then goes on to the next generation, and the daughter starts her kid on a diet. And you look back and many times people look back at pictures of themselves at 5 or 10, and they weren't fat. It wasn't like they needed any change in their eating habits, or even a doctor could say that they needed, but it was the mother's own diet trauma.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's really, really very prevalent. It's not something that we talk about much.
I think there's a multitude of things. I think, and this is what I can speak from experience because I don't have the experience of racism, but I do of diet culture.
Yeah.
Diet culture is not recognized as problematic right now, just like racism wasn't 60, 70 years ago, wasn't problematic. So nobody talked about it. Now we realize the problem. I think that's what's going to happen in 70 years from now with diet culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no research, there's nobody willing to look at the consequence of it, but we're seeing it in our practice.
Yeah. And I think it is intergenerational trauma because people are, exhibiting the same kind of signs: loss of self-esteem. They are limiting their options many times. They are discriminated against based on their size, right? We know that for a fact. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and so it just continues. So I think there's a strong parallel, and there's even a strong parallel between racism against Black women that goes back to the early 1900s, where Black women's bodies were vilified.
Yes.
Their size was considered savage or evil or wrong. And that's the beginning. That's the beginning of the thin concept that white women, religious and good with God, would be thin. That was a sign of purity and everything right with the world if you were a thin white woman. And that thin ideal was created in contrast to racism against Black women's bodies. So,
did you read the book from Dr. Sabrina String, Fearing the Black Body?
yeah,
that's
I read that right after it came out. I was on her list to get one of the first books, and
I'll link it in the show note because Carolyn gave you a 2-minute spiel, but that's her dissertation for a PhD. Her entire book is on that.
Yeah,
with supporting evidence. That's why we can say diet culture is rooted in racism.
Yes, it is rooted in racism, but I also want to just invite all of us, just like what you're doing, Stephanie, educating yourself, because I know that I've experienced in my speaking engagements discrimination from people who are engaged in the weight stigma movement, who, consider themselves feminist and so on and so forth, but yet still have racist beliefs. So I think this is a really great time for all of us to educate. I mean, I lived it, but I'm still educating myself. I'm still going deeper. I'm still looking at the places where I have bias, where I may unconsciously be, have negative feelings about someone. And I think, your podcast is a great effort at helping with that. But I think that's so important that we not assume that we know just from what we've seen on TV or what we've heard in the media, but, use some of these resources. I'll give you the link to my TEDx talk, which describes my own experience of intergenerational trauma and its effect on my work with people with addictions and eating disorders. So,
in the same way that the slavery and racism trauma was passed on to you from generation to generation, I want white people to understand that white privilege is passed on from generation to generation to generation.
Perfect point.
Right?
Perfect point.
Like, I didn't decide that I was going to exercise my white privilege.
No.
I was raised unconsciously to have them and to enjoy them and not question them.
And not even notice them.
No.
So that's what that metaphor, what the Harvard professor was saying. If you are in that room where all the signs say open, you don't even know that there are people out on the other side where the sign says closed. You don't even notice that because you're enjoying your privileges and everybody out around you is enjoying their privileges. And no one's looking on the other side of the wall and saying what. And if they are looking on the other side of the wall, they're looking at those folks and say, well, they should have worked harder.
Yes.
Or if they had just been better Americans, if they adapted to the American way of life, that's what they say about immigrants. They shouldn't be wearing their hijabs. They shouldn't be talking their language. That's how Native Americans were traumatized. They took their language, they took their culture, etc.
And in Canada, we started the discussion offline. In Canada, that's where racism is centered around Indigenous population.
The First Nation people, yeah.
Right. We completely, as white Canadian or our ancestor, completely destroyed them.
Yeah.
And now they're trying to rebuild with generation and generation of trauma that we imposed them by imposing a way of life to them.
And speaking of which, I saw a YouTube video on an interview from a Canadian station just on that topic. And it was really interesting because there were two they were not Native Americans, but two Indigenous people from Canada. One had been a former chief and the other was a professor. And then on the other side were two researchers who were white. And their point of view was really like the Indigenous people's point of view was, you're doing research on us from your point of view. You're not asking us what we need, how we define good health and well-being. You're trying to tell everybody, oh, this is what, the Indigenous people need. Instead, and then the other woman's perspective was, well, if you Indigenous people didn't have so many lawyers trying to sue everybody, then things would get done. And that's exactly what we have happening in the United States. The same kind of comments are being made about what's happening in the wake of George Floyd's and Ahmaud Arbery's death and, all of the other deaths over the years that have piled up.
Let's talk about, and we're going to kind of wrap up the interview on that, but the effect of intergenerational trauma on social determinant of health / COVID-19 in the Black community.
Yeah, we did a webinar for IADEP, which is the Eating Disorder Association. It's international now. So on the effect of COVID in the Black community. And I mean, it's horrific but you can't just look at COVID. Again, this is the effect of intergenerational trauma. When you look at parts of the country that had the highest number of slaves, those Black people, the descendants of those slaves, have shorter lifespans. They have more diabetes, heart disease, and so on. So now you come to COVID. So you have this whole group of people, Black people, both in the South and the North, whose health has been affected by lack of access to education, to insurance, to, et cetera, and a bias against health because of the experimentations that were done on Black people. And many of them have these chronic conditions, even those like me who are highly educated, professional. I have some of those too. And I've been very healthy my whole life, never smoked, never this, never that. So now this group of people are the highest risk group, and they are being affected. I think it's something like 37% more deaths in Black communities from COVID-19, and a higher death rate in Latinos as well from COVID-19.
I think it's, again, very important for all of us to understand that it's not a personal choice. Call it leftover from generation preceding that.
The legacy.
Yeah, the legacy, the people having, that's what I meant by starting to step behind. They have all of this to deal with before even showing up at the starting line.
Yes, right.
So thank you very much for having taken this time to come and educate us.
Yeah, and I want to give you a thank you. I really appreciated the email you sent out with the wonderful resources.
Oh, thank you.
I can't remember the one, what was it called, but it had a list of articles and videos, and that was really, because people won't go and look for stuff, but if you give it to them, there's a small chance that
there's a better rate.
Yeah,
click through.
Rate. And just your willingness to go to the dark side and talk about tough stuff, I really appreciate.
I think it is my duty, because I'm very well involved into the world of sizeism and thin privilege and social determinant of health. And I cannot only stay in that arena and not consider my neighbor, right? My neighbor that have effect of racism. We're all in the same place. We just have different element playing at us.
Yeah, I think someone said it, if there's no justice for everyone, there's no justice for anyone. And I think the same goes for fairness, for, health, all of that. When I think of what's happened to the people who have died, it could have been one of my kids who would, and I have had sons who were harassed by the police, luckily not killed, but it could have been anyone. And if they can do that to the least of us, they can do that to the most of us too.
We all need to help each other. And to me, this is where my network and my ability to say, I don't know, and to say, hold on, let's bring Carolyn here, who knows more than me on this. That's her lived experience. Can she teach us about that? I think that's what we all need to do.
Yeah.
Even for my peers that teach about health and don't talk about sizeism as an issue, I need to be invited into their world to teach their people.
Right.
Because that's my field of expertise. That's my lived experience.
Right. Exactly.
And then I bring people like you to come and teach to my community.
Yeah. Excellent.
So tell us a little bit about what you do outside of teaching about intergenerational trauma. What else you do?
I'm a physician. I did follow in my grandfather's footsteps, and I specialize in treating eating disorders and addictions. So I'm in San Diego. I have a private practice, but I actually work with people around the country with telemedicine. And I have an online program for people with binge eating, compulsive overeating, food addiction, emotional eating. And that's called the Anchor Program. So if anyone's interested, it's anchorprogram.com.
Yes. And I highly recommend it.
And I have to say that Stephanie has markedly contributed to my success through her friendship and consulting work.
Yeah.
So, but my program works with people who have had trauma and adverse childhood experiences, who have experienced racism and so on. So it's a little deeper than what most of the diet programs offer, because I don't do dieting. I'm like you.
But you have a notch of expertise with eating disorder that I don't play in that arena. So we each have our own little world.
Yeah.
And that's your expertise. That's what you've been doing for 30 years now?
Yeah, let's just leave it at 30, Stephanie.
Okay, we'll leave it at 30 years.
Women from the South of the United States never talk about.
We don't talk age. Okay. We're not going to bring ageism in the picture,
No,
right?
let's not. There's too much. There's sexism, ageism, all that isms.
Sizism and racism. We're not going to go there. Okay.
Right. We don't need to. But thanks so much for the opportunity to share my experience with your listeners.
Yeah, very welcome. Have a good day.
You too.
So there you have it, ladies. As I promised in the beginning, I will share my action plan. So first off, we've written a commitment as a company. We will link in the show note, or you can go to stephaniedozia.com/anti-racism. And inside of that podcast, I've linked to what we're doing here and all the resources that we are using, books and documentaries, and also resource center from anti-racist experts. I would highly recommend you go check that out. If you are a student of the Going to Beyond the Food Academy, you have been invited to a workshop that we did on white privilege, and recording will be available to you as well. So we are working as a community within my program to help us, white people, understand our privilege and how to alter our beliefs and our thoughts around those privilege using self-coaching, which is what we teach within the academy. If you're someone who also has been impacted by the passing on of dieting from generation to generation, perhaps you learned from your mom and maybe your mom learned from her mom, and you want to stop that cycle. You want to recover, you want to heal from that so you don't pass it on to the next generation. I would highly recommend that you come and join us in the Intuitive Eating Project. We do have a live experience, so which means that I'm doing the project with you this summer. We start June the 29th and we go on for 5 weeks. You can register for that depending when you're listening to this podcast. Hopefully it's in before the closing date of June the 28th. You can use the link in the show notes. Thank you very much, sister, for having been with us in this very important concept and learning with us. And I look forward to hang out with you on the next podcast.